To meet him for the first time last year. He's pretty impressive because he's good working with his hands and he builds some cool stuff, as you see. Well, where'd he get up with these ideas for the cool stuff? And that's what he's going to tell us about. He's an Oklahoma guy, and he's known since the age of 5 that he would somehow eventually be working with electrogravitics. He studied vortex science, and at one point he saw the Japanese Dogu statue, and he found out that that had electrogravitics and quantum physics encoded into its design. So he was a mechanical engineer for 20 years. He got involved in an industrial accident, which has driven him into research full time. And so he is going to give us, at this point, a 10,000-year-old cheat sheet for our research. Here's Robert Patterson.
Robert stuck in the seat.
Oh, there you go. Okay.
I've got a rather difficult story to share with you. Went through a lot of debilitating situations, pretty rough life. But all these experiences culminated into a positive outcome. I started studying vortex science around 1984, and I began by reading Victor Schauberger's work, and I went directly to the patent material. It was all I could find. I had no internet connection, no computer, virtually computer illiterate. And I began searching for a truth that was positive to myself. And as a young child, I was interested in hover technology, and I had built a few hovercraft designs. And I had built a few hovercraft designs. Is it going now? Thank you. I had built a few hovercraft designs, and they were based on just cigar boxes with skirts around them, and I tried to make them electric. And for some reason, they just wouldn't seem to hover or anything. And one day I was a little upset at it, and I crammed the battery into it, and off it fled across the parking lot and was smashed by a vehicle. And it was a pretty harrowing experience to have your favorite toy get smashed. But nobody really cultivated this in me. No one took the time to see my potential and help that grow. So many years passed, and I met up with a gentleman who taught me how to install heating, ventilation, and air conditioning. A very brutal man, huge 21-inch guns, and it was his way or the highway. And he would stand behind you and bark orders to the back of your head, and don't turn around or he's going to nail you. And so as I continued on, around 1996, I had a major breakthrough in discoveries. And it was based on the vortex science that I had been studying. Now, mind you, I had to put the work down. I literally had to force myself to read some of this work. Not that it was boring or anything, but you have to have time to ingest and incorporate this. And simultaneously, I was studying other things such as Wing Chun Kung Fu. And this particular art, it was invented by a woman named Ngui 350 years ago. She was a Shaolin priestess. And she was one of the 5 elders that escaped the disaster of their temple. And what she was conveying was to intercept, redirect, borrow the opponent's energy using structural kinetic leverage. That means in Wing Chun that the human body is capable of posing 108 structures that are kinetically structured. Imbalance. Properly balanced so that you can use pull or push, so that you can intercept and redirect. And at some point, I began to look at the environment as the opponent, and I decided, well, if I'm going to borrow energy from the opponent, I've got to base that on my physics. Well, my physics is coming from a 350-year-old science. And this physics is telling me that I have to use geometrical shapes and structures to borrow and leverage energy. As I'm going through the Encyclopedia of Flight, and I'm looking at this vortice on a wingtip, and listening to the aerodynamicists explain how we have to pay a price If we want to fly, we have to pay a price in drag. That's funny. If this is the wingtip, and I have high pressure air underneath and low pressure air on top, and I've created a convergence zone, and I cause a vortice to swirl off of there that pulls backwards on that geometry, I've got the building blocks for a no moving part motor. The wing is the stator, the rotor is the environment. So now we have a no moving part motor, and we can convey this through any device that we so choose to incorporate. But you have to have implosion and explosion. It's not one side of the energy equation or the other. If you use all brute force explosive technology, you get fossil fuel pollutions. In fact, the automobile is not a tool that you can just throw out the window because it pollutes. That Venturi vacuum, the vacuum energy is the intake. That's your vacuum energy. The combustion chamber holds the explosive energy, implosion, explosion combination. Despite the fact that it burns the fossil fuel, the key is all devices will utilize some type of fuel from the environment. It's there, and it's on the atomic level. Going through a lot of childhood difficulties and things between homes, between parents and things like that, I happened to find myself in Fayetteville, Texas with my dad around 1975. Some friends of his took myself and some other children out to play at the Falcon Heights Reservoir. And we got there and we were playing around, and one of the things I noticed was the dam is over here, and this is the water of the reservoir here. But they had a drain pipe, and in this drain pipe was a huge vortice. You could hear this thing roar, and you knew, even then, just looking at this thing, that if you got caught up into that vortice, it was just going to suck you in, and it was a tremendous amount of energy. As nightfall came, I noticed 4 stars that formed the shape of a diamond in the night sky. The only stars that were really visible at that point. This is the horizon line here, the yellow, and this is the night sky. And it's approximately southwestern. And I'm trying to explain to these people, look at these 4 stars, how odd they make the shape of a diamond or a kite, that kind of a shape. About the time the people were trying to figure out where these stars were, I indicated, well, look at the tree, and then off to that you can find these 4 stars. The very moment that the other people go, oh, look at that, the top star shoots out into the depth of space. Nada. There we go. So the top star here shoots out into the depth of space and stops. Shoots over westwardly, performs a loop-de-loop maneuver, shoots back over to its southern departure point, stops instantaneously. Shoots out into the depth of space, stops. Shoots over westwardly, pulls a loop-de-loop maneuver, shoots back over to where its departure point was and stops. Continues the next maneuver, stops suddenly. Shoots over here, pulls a loop-de-loop, comes back over here and stops suddenly. Takes off again, stops suddenly. Takes off again, and it's so far out into the depth of space we can no longer see it. And the sensation I had was, come on guys, you can get this. It's not that difficult. Now, this may be a schematic in itself. This may be a bridge rectifier. These may be plate capacitors or gap effect. These may be spark gaps. These may be coils. So we may have a message encoded right here. Okay? And these people are saying, come on, you can get this. It's not that difficult. Thank you. This is some of the hovercraft technology that I began developing. Some of you may be familiar with.
I didn't do that.
Can you move the next page, please?
Yes, I can.
Thank you very much. Some of you people may be familiar with this type of technology here. This is the ion hover technology. But what I did was realize that they were using only brute force. When they were taking their ion injectors and they're trying to put it in the bottle, the electromagnetic bottle, and they're trying to build up pressure. That is brute force, folks. It only works to a limited degree. You have to have an implosive cycle married to that brute force cycle in order to have the chain reaction of overunity and other superconductive energy levels that we're looking for. So what I did was...
Hit the lights. Okay. Oh, excuse me. Oh, that guy.
Oh,
That guy.
there's a slide up there?
so what I realized is that the injectors needed to be on the top of the bottle so that we could actually create electromagnetic vortices and catch a ride along that flux line with the ions, and therefore it's implosion and explosion. To continue to marry vortex science into this electronic method, I added an implosion impeller down here that the electromagnetic forces and the air and the ions could actually spin this implosion device, and now you can draw more energy and you can actually implode, suck the energy into your device and use it implosively and explosively in that combination. One side or the other will not work. If you take this implosive device off of here, you're right back to the explosive technology. It only goes so far. And you're going to find that there's many devices already incorporating implosion technology. The common combustion engine is an implosive, explosive device. That Venturi intake is your vacuum energy. That combustion chamber is your explosive cycle. That's implosion and explosion to get the chain reaction. You can't throw the basic building blocks out the window. It'd be like putting an Alka-Seltzer in a glass of water, and when the Alka-Seltzer fizzles out, you've depleted your source and you have to replenish your source. The source is here. It's all around us. Nikola Tesla told us that we would be attaching our machinery to the very wheel works of nature. The unifying factor for these energies is vortex technology, combined with what we already know. Disruptive discharge, explosive technology. You simply have to marry the other side of the equation. Albert Einstein told us that the mass energy equations were reversible. Therefore, we have reversible equations of mass energy. It's implosion, explosion, but it's not one side or the other. It's a marriage of the two together. As time progressed, I began to develop an actual working model of the hovercraft technology, and it continued to incorporate Victor Schauberger's implosion technology as turbocharging concepts. And we're going to find that the turbocharger is a huge building block for every energy concept that you want to build. You simply have to marry the fundamentals of those fluid dynamic physics. Nothing will change. It's all a redundant concept, from the water to the air to the electromagnetic spectrum to the ambient energy, 0-point energy. You're going to find that everything has a fluid dynamic functionality to it, and you have to keep that in your physics. You can't, if you throw that away, you're not going to have the mechanics to develop the device that you want to develop because you threw away part of the fundamental physics that marries all of this type of technology together. So I began to develop an implosion fan. And what I realized was that we needed to blow all the air out on a radial plane so that we could create a sinkhole and create a vortice that could actually add additional torque to that fan and that motor system. Further research led me to a radfoil, radial flow pump. And basically it's a dome-shaped device, and it has an impeller, radial fan impeller on the top of it in a little ducted sleeve, and now you can have a ducted sleeve, fan in a sleeve gives you 10-to-1 compression ratios or higher, so it's the analog to the piston in your engine, which you get a compression ratio. By putting a fan in a sleeve, you get a compression ratio. So now you can begin to see a similarity between technologies. Despite their dissimilarities, the functionalities are one and the same. And this is a piece of Victor Schauberger's work here, this S-shaped piping. And what he showed us was that we could connect the push and the pull energies together in this S-shaped pipe. And so at the end of it, we have the high velocity energy. And in this particular case, I took this radfoil pump, and I actually built one. I took a plastic salad bowl, a plastic bath fan that was a radial flow fan, and from underneath I came in with a little 30,000 RPM airplane motor, and I wired it to a little battery and trigger, and I pulled the trigger, and it didn't seem like anything was happening. And I decided to run my hand across this pump, and all of a sudden I could feel my hand being pummeled by some type of diamagnetic force, and I ended up having to drop kick the device because I was in fear that it was going to suck my hand into it. And so that's the device right there. And what we're looking at is a vortice that is formed on a radial flow pump. So we're expelling all the energy out on this radial flow plane so that we can have a void so that we can add energy through vortex energy and add that torque on the shaft. Now, fluids hug a curve against their own centrifugal force. So we go into an axial rotation, like it would look like a donut around the dome. So what you've done is you've made a void for this dome to travel in, fluids hugging a curve against their own centrifugal force. They can't continue the radial plane and they follow the dome because fluids hug the curve against their own centrifugal forces. So all of these basic building blocks, everything you've heard from every researcher here is absolutely correct. The only thing that I'm advocating is that you employ implosion, explosion to get your chain reaction. If you don't have both sides of the coin, it's like building a bicycle, it's missing a pedal. So you can push with this foot down, but where's your implosive cycle that would have brought the other foot back up to push it into another explosive cycle? So you're missing a complete piece of the puzzle that makes the complete chain reaction. Now, around 1996, I had a breakthrough that is just phenomenal. Most of you aren't even going to be able to deal with the fact that this is a 10,000-year-old artifact. And on this artifact is an impeller. Here's the little winglet right here. Here's the canard. And here's the main wing. Okay? And from that, I extrapolated a ram implosion wing. I recognize this as an impeller shape. And my mind just goes off. I'm asking myself all these questions. Why on earth does this 10,000-year-old figurine have this implosive insignia encoded into it? And so I continued the research, and I continued to decode information from this ancient schematic. It's called a Dogu. It was unearthed in Japan. There's approximately 4,500 of them been unearthed. And I began to get into all kinds of things. Energy research and the truth, the journey and seeking truth will lead you into some pretty strange bedfellows, let's say. And 1997, after making this discovery on this Dogu figurine, I was at the height of disability and everything. I was very angry. I was angry at the world. I'm angry at the government. I was injured at work, and all of a sudden I'm a criminal. They're kicking me while I'm down. And this anger just fueled me to find a positive walk. And I knew even at the time of about 4 or 5 years of age, the two main things that I had a premonition were that at sometime around 2001, I would be working with electrogravitic propulsion systems. Now, I hadn't quite figured out in '96 that that's what was on this Dogu figurine, but as we travel a little further, we'll see. So in 1996, something just compelled me, but let me step back a little bit, to the premonition. The premonition was that I'd be working with electrogravitic propulsion and that I would be taking a walk with our Creator. And I just put it off and put it off and put it off. Well, when your Creator wants your attention, he or she is going to get it one way or another, whether they humble you in one way or another. You're going to take that walk. And the people that have no faith, you're going to have nothing to show for your lack of faith. That's the point. You have to have faith in some of these technologies that you discover. That's the point. Now, as time progressed, 1996 is our time zone, I ventured to the 6th Annual UFO Symposium. I had zero money in my pocket. I barely had enough gas money to get there. When I get there, I start talking to people, and I'm explaining this discovery that I've made. And a few of the members took me by the arm, and one lady took her badge off of her and stuck it on me and walked me inside. So I crashed the party. During these lectures that were given at the 6th Annual UFO Symposium, Dr. Lee Shargel was there and presenting this swept-forward aircraft. No one in the audience, nor Lee Shargel, even realized which direction this craft was going. This is obviously the nose cone. This is obviously the tail. This is a swept-forward aircraft. This is the aircraft that is believed to have crashed at Roswell, New Mexico. If this did a nosedive and slammed into the earth across this plane here, all you would see would be this tail section, which would appear to be a saucer to you. So at first glance, you would think, oh, it's a saucer. But when you dig it out of the earth and you begin reverse engineering it, you realize that it's a swept forward aircraft. I also see similarities to the space shuttle. If you look at this fuselage here, very reminiscent of the space shuttle. If you minimize these wings here, you've got a lot of space shuttle resemblance in my opinion there. This is a photograph taken by NASA. Liz Edwards discovered this in 1998. This is also a swept forward craft. This craft is sitting off of our sun, eavesdropping on our goings-on. She wrote letters to NASA and various other people and asked questions. What is this? It was ice crystals.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, parked adjacent to the sun, ice crystals. It's space junk. It's debris. It's Mars. Anything but the swept forward vehicle that you can see right here in this. It's not very hard. This is the heat signature from this vehicle. And you can see that it's a swept forward vehicle. You can see that it has a hyperbolic curve in here. You can see an egg shape here. And it's sitting out there by the sun and it's eavesdropping on our communications. Just as this is a swept forward vehicle, this too is a swept forward vehicle. Now I've had several other encounters with unidentified flying craft. One in particular in California, I saw coming from the south a light, what I thought was an aircraft. As it continued on across, it came adjacent to a star and it stopped in front of that star and it camouflaged itself using the light from the star. After a few seconds, it proceeded on to the next star. When it got adjacent to that star, it stopped and camouflaged itself. It did that for 6 or 7 stars and went on up to some other stars, and it broke off into 2 lights. It remains there today. Another encounter I had was about 9 p.m. I came out of my mom's house. I saw a light coming from the south going north. Looked like an airplane to me. I look around because it's dark to take a few more steps. I look up, and all of a sudden I realize that this craft is spiraling out into the depth of space. It's no longer traveling from south to north, and it's still there to this day. This is some footage of some of these swept forward craft. Now what we really have here is a superconductive technology. You hear a lot about these craft out there that are glowing. The reason they're glowing is they're superconductors the size of a spacecraft. They're self-cooling. The superconductive technology is self-cooling. The cooling is brought on by vortex and harmonics. Harmonics are self-cooling, and vortices can be self-cooling. Here we have a convergence zone, high pressure to low pressure, and we have a vortice that forms here. If we energize this, in fact, if we coat this material with the proper conducting materials, ceramics, then we can cause it to cool itself. We should be able to scale this down or scale this up. And we would want to use a specific type of power plant to energize this ceramic. And you have to have a selective geometric shape because we're dealing with the fluid dynamics of quantum physics. We're no longer dealing with the backyard mechanics of electricity. We're going to have to go to a hybrid level and change our thinking a little bit. And that thinking only requires that you take what you know about explosive technology and marry that to an implosive technology so that you have the chain reaction to gain the types of energies that you're after. You're after over-unity. You're after superconductivity. You're after anti-gravitational technology. If there's no explosion and there's no implosion, you have one side of the equation only. I want to play that's a video. Just can you play that? The bottom black, click it, thank you. This is footage of an actual swept forward craft, very similar to the craft that I'm showing you. And the reason it's glowing is it's a superconductive technology the size of a spacecraft. It's self-cooling. It's self-cooling via its geometric structure. It's self-cooling via its energy manipulation, harmonics, and vortex implosion. It's a marriage of explosion and implosion technology. They are not using one side of the equation or the other. In fact, many of these crafts that you see that are making all these extraordinary maneuvers out there, it's because they followed a different concept than we did. They followed the insect, whereas we followed the bird. But they also followed the bird, but they utilized more of the realization that they gained from the insect. If you watch any insects, they're out there flying around all erratic, making all these erratic maneuvers, yet they're in control. You look up and you see all these unidentified flying craft making all these erratic movements, yet they're in control. They obviously followed a different way of thinking than what we did. But we can use reverse engineering. Their espionage has failed. In other words, we've been contaminated by their technology simply by using reverse engineering methodology. You can reverse engineer what they are showing us. And they may, in fact, want us to know this. And if you, as you look at this presentation, you'll see that it's kind of obvious they're really trying to communicate with us, and you really have to be aware of your environment. That's implosion and explosion. And it's occurring in everything around us, not one side or the other. We're the ones that made the mistake and made everything one side or the other. When we put our vehicle through the spectrum, we're putting it through the spectrum 180 degrees out of phase. If you make this the front and this the back, it's 180 degrees out of phase. If we're going to build an airplane based on a bird, that's called bioengineering. That's nature's toolbox. The next thing that comes from a bird is a vessel, an egg. So if we're going to ride in a vessel, why don't we ride in the vessel the same way that it passes through the environment? From front to back, not 180 degrees out of phase. Okay? The aerodynamicist that thought this up, he's thinking that he can slide the air off this way of the vehicle. Well, look at the friction this is creating for me to slide my hand in this way. If I turn this around in phase and the air comes over, it slides off this way and the push of energy goes that way. So I just borrowed energy from my opponent. Now I'm using my Wing Chun skills in physics to borrow the energy from a different kind of opponent, nature. As I continued to research this technology, and this is going more into the ancient technologies that I deciphered from the Dogu figurine, every single artifact that I've examined on the planet has bioengineering encoded into it. That means they're using a push and a pull technology, an implosion and an explosion technology. Every single artifact unearthed on the planet has circuitry encoded into it. High levels of mathematics. We do not yet even speak that language. This is a ram implosion wing or a ram induction wing. It's a device that I translated from an ancient schematic, and because I was looking for a method of application, I attempted to join the X Prize for the $10 million prize for an anti-gravitational technology. I have my wing, I have my propulsion system. They rejected all anti-gravitational applications based on the fact that it was an unproven technology. So, looking for some type of avenue, attempting to contact people on the net, and let me tell you, that's one big ridicule. You know, when you present something to someone and you show them proof of concept, and it's a very negative situation there. I've been freedom of speech has been opposed. If I go on a website and I present information, I'm called all kinds of names by the members. My access to that forum will be stripped and I will be unallowed any further response. Despite the fact that I don't call anybody names, I don't abuse anybody, what I do is I extrapolate the research material page by page, paragraph by paragraph, name by name, who did what, and I will come back at you with that information. So I put this on my vehicle. I put it on several other vehicles. I managed to ask several people if they would allow me to utilize their vehicle to test this device. After explaining it to them a little bit, and some of them were mechanically inclined, and I explained to them that, you know, this should improve our mileage because it's using vortex science to give us additional energy. And so they allowed me to put it on their vehicle, and when I did, lo and behold, we doubled their fuel mileage. These were very short tests. One test consisted of 100 miles, and the man drove his vehicle from where we lived in Oklahoma to Dallas, Texas, 100 miles. And with the wing on, he topped off his tank. Normally he got 18 miles to the gallon. We get down there, we take the wing off, we drive home, we take out our miles per gallon paperwork and everything, and we start going through the math. And it's kind of funny because the man was standing at the counter and he's sitting here doing the figures, and his jaw about hit the counter. Goosebumps the size of an egg came up on his skin, and he's just looking and going, It's double the mileage. Double the mileage. Why? Because we removed the brute force. The vehicle is creating an antagonistic situation by virtue of its 180-degree out-of-phase shape and the fact that it has a smooth texture on it. There's nothing in nature that has a smooth texture on it. We made another faux pas. And you're saying, oh, but wait a minute, laminar flow flows over a smooth texture. Yes, but it sticks to that texture and causes friction. Okay? Adhesion. Yes, coadhesion. And in order to remove that, you have to have a textured surface. And you have to correct the geometry. First and foremost, the vehicles that we're driving are 180 degrees out of phase. You cannot slide the air off this way and not have friction. You must slide the air off this way, and that way you gain energy. If this was a seed and I squeeze it, I'm going to squeeze it from this end to eject it across the room. So where's the circuit open and where's the circuit closed? We're still making the same kinds of devices no matter what medium we use, whether it's water, air, or the electromagnetic spectrum. The physics and the mechanics are the same. Nothing will change, people. Nothing. Except your mind and your application. Implosion and explosion married together. Not one side or the other. So after testing this on a few people's vehicles, my friend kept telling me, and again, I'm suffering disability and I'm having a really hard and difficult time with this, but the original wing that I put on my vehicle weighed 100 pounds. So I was a little leery with my disability about carrying this thing up a ladder and putting it on my rooftop. I was also very concerned about it coming off the roof rack. And so I talked to a friend of mine and got him to evaluate the roof rack, and he decided it would handle it. So I devised a method of installing this 100-pound wing on my vehicle. And it was really gross, really elaborate, had a lot of wood and metal pieces in the way. It was just overkill. And I take the vehicle out, and I've been previously testing it before I put the wing on. The vehicle would go 10 miles on a gallon of gas. And the way we determined that was we metered exactly 1 gallon into, we have 2 tanks, we metered exactly 1 gallon into the spare tank. We get in the vehicle, and at 65, 68 miles an hour, it dies out at 10 miles out. So I flip the switch to the main tank and turn around and come back. I put the wing on my vehicle. I go back to the gas station, I put the same 1 gallon in, and I go 27 miles before it goes put, and dies out. During that time, I continued to make adjustments and refinements. I saw higher mileages. I saw lower mileages. I began to try to communicate with people on the net. I was called all kinds of names. I was told to shut up and listen to them. Maybe I'd learn something about fundamental physics. That after all, they were in college, and their professor was an aerodynamicist, and if anybody could have thought of this technology, he would have. And so at one point, I realized that this wasn't working for me, and the reason it wasn't working for me was because I had made this discovery based on an interpretation from an ancient Dogu figurine. As I continued behind the scenes investigating and looking for more answers, because I wanted to make comparisons of all these artifacts that were unearthed, and as I'm going through the research, I'm hearing a resounding message. The word artifact is used in antenna technology. The word pyramid is used in electronic technology. The word mu is used in mathematics and electronics. And all of these are ancient terms. And yet we're using them in our modern linguistics. And guess what? We're using the terms. Here's the thing, the physics that was suppressed, vortex science. Imagine that derelict out there on the corner of the street. And had he been educated with this vortex science, he might not be that derelict. He might be a genius. But because the technology was suppressed, he doesn't get to fulfill his destiny. So I realized that trying to explain the deciphering of this ancient technology to people, it wasn't working for me. Nobody would talk to me. I was being called all sorts of names. You name it, I was called it. So I decided, look, let me separate myself from this technology and this other discovery. The moment that I went online strictly with the technology, hundreds of people began to communicate with me. At some point, they said, well, Mr. Patterson, how on earth did you make this discovery? And it's like, yeah, I'm really kind of gun-shy at this point, but I thought, what the heck? I don't want to perpetuate any type of deception. That's why I'm not going to stand here and say, I invented this. I did not invent this. This is a translation, a verbatim translation from an ancient schematic. We were obviously meant to receive a message. The message that the primitive people received was that they were gods and deities and we worshiped them. Wrong message, folks. It's a quantum physics message because the people that brought the message brought it themselves. They didn't try to beam it anywhere. They came in a vehicle. This is the technology they came in. So once I separated myself from the original discovery and went strictly technology, hundreds of people began to communicate with me. And then they would ask, how on earth did you make this discovery? And so I decided to go ahead and show them. I never heard from them again once they saw how the original discovery was made. I've noticed that a lot of you here that have talked to me out there, you have a very hard time realizing that this is a quantum dynamic message. It's core-based in bioengineering, vortex science that's encoded into these figurines. This is that technology. I went the wrong. It should be this one to go backwards, right?
Oh, I see what's happening.
And one more. Okay. Now, here we have the ancient Dogu figurine. This was my Rosetta Stone. I discovered this on page 133 of the Anti-Gravity Handbook written by David Hatcher Childress. He was discussing various nuclear holocausts that occurred in our ancient history and that they extrapolated from Sanskrit, ancient Sanskrit, that they had extrapolated these stories. Everybody's calling that mythology. Sorry, folks, it's not a myth, it's a reality. This is a technology that's encoded into these figurines. Now, the first thing that really piqued my interest was I wanted to find the source of this information. David Hatcher Childress only had this one photograph, but he did mention Von M. Green had done a comparison between modern-day spacesuit and this ancient Dogu figurine. So I was rather intrigued, and I began to look at it. One of the questions that was posed to Mr. Green was, what are these spiraling waves here? Well, guess what, folks? A spiraling wave energy is basic vortex implosion concept. So that began to ring true to me. But the more I looked at it, the more abstract it appeared to be. It didn't make a hill of beans to me other than it was some primitive artifact. And then I began to look at Von M. Green's comparison to spacesuits. And I began to look at the comparison, and as I did, I happened to notice this impeller shape at the base of this statue here. And here you can see the winglet, the canard, and the main wing. And here you see the winglet, the canard, and the main wing. Okay? And as I looked at that, it began to ring true, and I'm asking myself, what is a 10,000-year-old figurine doing with implosion signias encoded into it? As I continued on my research journey, I began to go on the internet, and I was asking questions. At this point, I've found a path of learning that isn't stagnant for me. Conventional learning was very stagnant. It didn't go anywhere. In fact, it's not going anywhere because they are only using one side of the energy equation. And generally, that's an explosion technology. You can't get a chain reaction, a complete chain reaction from that. You must marry an implosion cycle to your explosive cycle to get a complete chain reaction. Otherwise, you only have half the equation, half the energy. That's why your over-unity devices are not seeing large amounts of energy. You're using one side of the energy spectrum or the other, and you haven't married the two together. As I continued to ask questions, I realized I had to come up with a secret identity. And so I had to go online, and I came up with temporal subliminal man. And because I could be seen and not heard. Nobody got that? It was backwards. And so anyway, I began to pose questions. Most of them were electronics, and what I did was devise a method of looking at research that had come before. I wanted to use a comparison of research that matched what I was beginning to understand in this decoding. I went right back to Hertz's original experiment, which demonstrated electromagnetic energy. He used a coil with spark gaps and a coil to transmit that energy. And what I did was pose a scenario that utilized Hertz's original experiment, but I beefed it up using magnetron tubes and capacitors and things, and I simply used what I was extrapolating here to pose this scenario and ask a question that I needed answered. One person comes back at me and says, hey, yeah, Bob, I can read between the lines here, and it's obvious that you know more than you're letting on. What the heck is it you're really into? Well, I'm into this alternative energy device that, oh, well, you're an idiot. You're a crackpot. You're too stupid to know what you're talking about. That's funny. 5 minutes ago, you told me that I obviously knew more than what I was letting on. Well, obviously I do, because I have a 10,000-year-old cheat sheet. Okay? So I'm able to pose questions to you in any form. I gave an example of it last year when I described the functionality of a common utility that we all use, a hyperbolic vortex amplification implosion device. Every one of us owns one. It's called a common toilet. And I gave you the example. That's an energy device, and you really have to pay attention to your environment, because you're missing the boat. That's a building block. The way that that device functions, the common toilet, is the same way the common turbocharger functions. It's the same manner in which you have to make your devices function. Implosion and explosion. Push and pull energy. It took me a number of years, but I figured out pretty rapidly what some of these symbols were. The lumped elements came very easy because I was studying Nikola Tesla and looking for confirmation to what I was discovering. I realized that this was a loop necklace. And so in my illustrated dictionary of electronics, I'm self-taught. I have no formal education. So in my research for my truth, I realized, well, I look at this as a loop, and I'm thinking, well, what are these trinkets on there? They're just lumps. Oh, lumps. Wait a minute, lumped elements. Oh, am I looking at a tank circuit? Yes. We're looking at spark gap electrodes. We're looking at a loop. And we're looking at lumped elements. Lumped elements are either capacitors or coils. And here we have the capacitor, here we have the coil, here we have the spark gap electrodes. This tank circuit is this tank circuit. These reverse wave radio cavities are these reverse wave radio cavities. Now, if you invert this particular statue, and invert is another clue. Why would I invert it? Well, because the large end always precedes the small end. So I inverted it. But when I did, there's hidden information here. You don't see it unless you invert it. But it's another clue telling you that you're developing some type of inverter. So in fact, that's what we're going to do, is take the environment and invert it from one form to another so that we have not only usable energy, but an implosion propulsion methodology, which is how these people are telling us they got here, through bioengineering. I basically had the wing first, and then I developed and produced these components. I realized what these components were. From this end to this end, I realized what the components were, that they were radio cavities. My first impression was tweeter. And most people are saying, oh, those are breasts. Okay, but what they're talking about is covalence bonding. When a mother holds her child and she's bonding with her child, all these ancient figurines that are doing this, they're actually discussing covalent bonding. They're not talking about a mother-child relationship per se. They're talking about covalence bonding, atomic structures, quantum physics, not goddesses and deities. You really got to upgrade your thinking, get your mind out of the gutter. It's covalent bonding, not bonding between mother and child. So basically, I have this portion of the circuit assembled, and I'm looking at this, and I realize, well, that's a choker necklace. Well, it took me a number of years to realize that, well, you know, what do women call all these little trinkets and things and their little doodads? And so I began to go around and ask women what this might be, you know, and what they're thinking, you know. And one lady happened to say, well, beads. Oh, beads. Well, let me go back to my dictionary. And I go back, and lo and behold, I find ferrite beads. And I realize, well, that's some type of choke coil. Why would they have it in the choke position? So I'm thinking it's a choke coil of some kind. As the research continues, I realize that this is a multi-element ferrite bead core, a matrix transformer. It has the potential to decouple RF and allow other energies to pass. This is an optical waveguide insignia. In fact, there's a polyphase counterclock rotating wave, a vortice on his head. There's wave crests. This is a wave crest. And it has faces. This is the eye. the nose, and the lips. Here's its lips. And it's puckered and it's whistling. And there's other faces in this wave, and they're wave crests, and they have faces. And each one has their lips puckered in a different position as if they were whistling. Another clue. I attempted to ask on the internet, I realized this was a choke joint groove. Don't ask me how, it just came to mind. I also knew this was some type of microwave device, that this was a tapered waveguide, in fact. And I began to scavenge components from obsolete C-band antenna dishes and stuff. And I didn't know what the terms were. I didn't know what the components were. I have a basic dictionary that gives you a sentence that says a choke joint groove is an aperture that allows energy to pass between cavities without some type of interconnection. And it just boggled my mind. It didn't make a bit of sense to me. So I'm looking up microwave stuff on the internet, and I find this site that says, "We'll answer your microwave question." So I go and I pose a question to the guy, and I get a letter back after a week or so, and he says, "We're not answering your questions. You're trying to get rich off our knowledge." Well, I don't know the guy from Adam. So I typed the guy back and said, "Look, I'm just a guy, doing some research. I'm 30 miles out in the backwoods of Oklahoma caring for my 98-year-old grandmother, and I'm trying to conduct research and teach myself something during this time." Finally, he writes back, and he says, "Okay, a choke joint groove is this. An aperture, right there, choke joint groove, an aperture that allows electrical continuity between two waveguides without connections." And he gave me some more explanations, but the explanation he gave me just turned on the lights. I realized that, okay, this is an optical waveguide, that the flange, the choke flange, is the actual flange that mates the resonant cavities together. See, I didn't know. I have no formal education. There was nobody there to be a sounding board. I tried to pose the proper questions, but they chose to just call me names instead. So it took a long time. It took about 6 years to decode this. And at some point, I began to make a reduction and simplify things. I went through all sorts of research, and I found out that we had an optically pumped, atom-coupled optical waveguide, and that we're dealing with quantum electrodynamics, loosely described as the study of light. In fact, all energy is from light. Every star in the universe is pumping out the very energy that all we have to do is tap into. If you want to call it zero-point energy, if you want to call it vacuum energy, if you want to call it photon, it doesn't matter. It's all frequency-based. Select your frequency and decide which implosion-explosion methodology you prefer to use on that frequency. Now, I'm going to suggest that we use the atomic transition frequency of a photon. Why? Because that's the information that I have discovered and coded into this. It's the same information that when you go into our mainstream science and you read quantum electrodynamics, cavity QED technologies, we find that we have right here a 10,000-year-old cheat sheet with all the apertures, all the slots, and everything we need. As you can see, I've been talking for a while, and here we have an induction battery that has a magnet in here, and as a rule, you would shake this magnet through the coil, and you've created a generator which charges the battery, which then lights your LED light. I've removed the battery. There is no battery. No one's been up here shaking this. It's still running. It was running last night. In fact, they turned it off because it was shining in somebody's window. But it's still running. In fact, I ran the circuit here is a little defective, but you can see it's just not a good connection. But this is just to prove a little concept that, look, we are transmitting some type of energy despite the fact that this is a non-operational technology. I really detest presenting a non-operational type of technology, but at least we have a little bit of proof that something is occurring here. We have a frequency meter. We can actually see impedance impedance and what the megahertz reading is, somewhere between 140 and 300 megahertz. We can also see an ion field sometimes, and there it pegged the needle. And again, you can see it peg the needle. I'll try to hold it where you can see it and sniff out a field. This may be interfering with it to some degree because it's absorbing it. There we go again. But what we have in dipoles, slotted line antenna. We have it's the same thing. You have to really pay attention to the similarities between things. What you'll discover is that every single circuit that we're going to employ is all going to be Tesla coil technology. Every single one of us are going to use a resonant circuit. You have no choice. Thank God we have a giant shoulder to stand on. This is an optical waveguide. This is what we're going to tap the 0-point energy with. This is actual vacuum fluctuations that occur in an optical waveguide. We've slotted the lens, so now we have a positive-negative junction. We have a diode. We have a photovoltaic cell, frequency-based. It's not light-based, it's frequency-based. We're going to transition through the transition frequency of a photon, and we're going to also use inversion technique to invert this. In fact, if you're familiar with Young's two-slit experiment, and you have a slit, you get a black and a white plane inside of on the back of your screen, and you have a negative and a positive, a light and a dark. I think what we're looking at is alternating current in that situation. In either case, we're going to form a lattice. Anytime that you have a light passing through a slot, you form a lattice when you have reflections. In that lattice, we have an atomic structure. That atomic structure is photons. When the light penetrates the slot and it makes reflections and it bounces back out, you end up with a lattice pattern. At the point of each one of these lattices is atomic mass. So now we have a mass. We've accumulated a mass. Let's call that our fusion. Now, we're going to split that mass. We're going to call that fission. Remember what I said about implosion and explosion? You cannot have any machine without both. Look at your automobile. Didn't it convey you here using implosion, explosion technology? You cannot throw that building block out the window. You have to maintain that physics of implosion, explosion, and fuel exchange. What's the fuel? The fuel is the environment. The fuel is the environment. It's in the environment. It's being pumped out by every star and every cosmos. It's 0-point energy. It's frequency-based. It's photons. Sometimes an atom, or sometimes light acts as a particle. Sometimes it acts as a wave. Listen to the resounding fluid dynamics. The water has a molecule and it has a wave when you put so much of it together. All those stars out there are pumping that ocean full of energy, wave energy, and in all of its particles and all of its atoms. It's still fluid dynamics, folks. You cannot throw the basic building block out the window. That ether, that ambient background energy, is a fluid, has fluidic properties. You cannot throw it out the window. It's a vacuum because it's also rotating and it's creating a suction head. So we're dealing with a mechanical entity, not a void. People say, a lot of higher echelon mainstream people say that nature abhors the vacuum. My question is, how come the whole cosmos is in a vacuum? If nature abhors the vacuum, why is the entire cosmos in a vacuum? It takes both forces, implosion and explosion. So to say that it abhors the vacuum, to me, just doesn't ring anything of any clarity or any truth. So we have an optical waveguide here. It took me a number of years. This was the last thing that I decoded. It's very difficult to give a full rendition of this, but some of the things that I realized were from turbocharging concepts. So you're basically looking at an electromagnetic implosion propulsion, a turbocharger. We have a Tesla antenna concept with a disruptive discharge to drive an implosive cycle. Here's the mass inside the optical waveguide. Here's an incoming neutron. There's a vacuum fluctuation symbol. And here's where the mass split. So if we combine our atoms, we have fusion. If we split our atoms, we have fission. So we have both occurring within an optical waveguide. So you have to recognize both sides of that energy equation. Again, this is an ancient schematic showing us the way. Now, here we have Plosson's radiant energy converter. We have a similarity between Tesla's radiant energy converter. Moray, and various other people using this same type of technology. This particular antenna in particular is this structure that you see right here. You have a transformer and you have a resonant cavity. We have capacitance, inductance. Because it's an antenna technology, we can simultaneously receive and transmit. So when we load this circuit here and cause these gaps to fire, we are then transmitting an electromagnetic signature out to this tank circuit, which will collect the energy. We want to attempt to overload it across the capacitor to the coil and overload that so that it seeks the least path of resistance and then fires the spark gap here. Once the gap fires here, we've completed our explosive cycle. We now need to amplify the energy. And the only way to do that is to implode, to make an antenna technology that is an energy-sucking device. Because we have a paraboloid out here, any ambient energy that strikes that paraboloid is going to bounce out into the focal point. But as it departs the focal point, it spreads back out into the V shape. That V shape is very crucial to understand because it's actually, the environment is rotating. So it's not just fanning out into a V shape, it's fanning out into a vortice. So now we have this vortice that's drawing energy through the system. As this explodes, this implodes. We have beat frequency oscillation in a reverse wave cavity, a coaxial magnetron tube. These coaxial magnetron tubes is our turbocharging unit, albeit electromagnetic energy. If you compare a fluid dynamic turbocharger on your car and you understand the functionality of that device, you have the same function in a magnetron tube. It's just an electromagnetic turbocharger. But we're all talking about energy amplification. So the similarity of this particular circuit, you have a coil, capacitors, spark gap. This is the transformer. This is the antenna. Well, here's your antenna. This right here is your antenna. Here's your transformer. Right here's your transformer. Okay? This is a ferrite bead. This is ferrite bead transformer coil. It all came from a 10,000-year-old ancient schematic. I didn't invent this. This is what I interpreted. I did my best to understand the information and to go through a reverse engineering methodology to bring the technology to this point.
What does it do?
At some point, I began to realize that the word Dogu might have greater meaning. And I began to play like a license plate game. And instead of making names out of the numbers and letters that were there, I began to incorporate physics. C being velocity, P being, K being. And I began to play this and utilize all the physics terms in the license plate game. All of a sudden, I became aware of so much physics around us that we were just ignoring. I began to realize that television was still being used to subliminally seduce people. But they, instead of actually putting product between the frames, they simply changed it to color and frequency, and they impinged that information on our optic nerve, our fiber optics. Again, we're dealing with bioengineering. So if you want to look at fiber optics, you've got the mechanism right here. And so the scientists, what they did to us was begin to use subliminal technology through frequency and color, and they're flashing their message at you, and it's hitting you right in the brain. So I began to close off that kind of thinking and make a greater focus on what I had discovered. What I discovered was an implosive propulsion anti-gravitational technology that not only powered itself, but it can levitate. At this point, it is non-operational. It takes a long time to go through the research, to study it and learn it. It's a complete reverse methodology. You have to go and you have to find Tesla, and you have to understand all the Tesla coil and his radiant energy concept, and make the rationalization that that is a brute force construct and that it's simply missing the implosive cycle. And you find that implosive cycle through Victor Schauberger and William Baumgartner's work on implosion. But again, it's not one side or the other. It takes both sides of the equation, implosion and explosion. This is kind of where I separated myself from the ancient schematic and the technology. And again, as I said, it just wasn't working for me. This is the book I wrote, Ancient Astronauts, the Dogu Code, the 6,000-year-old anti-G schematic. And as you can see, I spent a number of years deciphering what this technology was encoded into these figurines. It's a quantum message. It's not a god, it's not a deity. That's a mistaken identity. These people intended us to have far more knowledge than what we're dealing with. I also found holographic information encoded into the ceramic composition of these figurines. I discovered it by accident. I noticed in a photograph, I realized that this particular photograph had been captured using a flash cube, a flash of light. That emitted enough beam energy to release holographic information that is encoded into this ceramic composition. And I'll further press forward and say that the composition of this ceramic material may well be the superconductive technology component that we're all looking for. It may even turn out to be similar type of material that we're already using in present time. Another discovery that I made that's going to sound really, really odd was I discovered a synthetic atom, a quantum dot. Again, I had no internet connection, no formal education, and yet I came up with this scenario based on vortex implosion. I realized that the dimple on the golf ball, which is generally used to reduce the wake signature of the ball so that the ball can fly farther through the air, but a golf ball was designed to release energy. It was designed to take on energy and release energy. Now you have 200 little paraboloid impressions on this golf ball. Each one of those little paraboloid impressions is giving off a little helical electromagnetic force. You package that golf ball in water-soluble foam, put it on board an airplane, you have just created a packaging blunder, a synthetic atomic pile, imitating a reaction. The reason it will imitate the reaction is we've put the golf ball, which has 200 little paraboloids on it, and I'm going to make the assumption that it's imitating an oxygen. And you give it these little helical energy sources, you put it in together with water-soluble foam, you pressurize the cabin and you inject the water into the foam. Now you're imitating magnetic moments. Imitation. You further exaggerate this volatile state by taking off in the aircraft. You have just entered the time continuum. Altitude equals time. Once you're there, there's more atomic matter that can bombard this synthetic pile that you have in your packaging blunder. You get on the radio communications and all of a sudden you've created a magnetic bottle. So now you're in a resonant cavity. The airplane becomes the resonant cavity. Inside this resonant cavity, you have an artificial atom, synthetically packaged in an artificial situation. What this does is it shows us that we can imitate an atom. It shows us in the late 70s, a scientist actually came up with a quantum dot, and he's imitating an atom and he's using this in his waveguide technologies. So how far-fetched is it to assume that a golf ball with its 200 little paraboloid impressions on it with a little electromagnetic helical packaged in water-soluble foam that is imitating magnetic moments in a magnetic bottle in the time continuum, that we couldn't have some type of unexplainable disaster? Okay? I pose this. I suggest we find out from the manifest how many of these aircraft were carrying this synthetic blunder of golf balls. Now that's the oddest thing that I found. I put that together through vortex science by realizing that each one of those little paraboloids on the ball has a little helical, a little electromagnetic helical. It has a little vortice. So now we have the makings of synthetic energy. So you can see why I pretty much separated myself from the technology versus the ancient schematic. As I said before, energy and the pursuit thereof leads down some pretty strange rabbit holes. This is my contact information. I have been attempting to put together a business based on this technology. And I've been trying to bring it to not only the mainstream, but the best reception that I had was from alternative community. I thank you for that. There were many people last year that assisted me with things that I needed and continued my progress forward, which is where we are today, and I'll conclude and answer any questions if you have them.
Okay, do we have any questions for Robert Patterson? How many people have never seen the implosion wing before? Raise your hands. Okay. First question, David.
I didn't have a question.
Oh, okay.
My brain is full. I'm having trouble thinking of a question.
Oh, I thought you raised your hand. Excuse me. Okay. Please pass it all the way to the back.
Thank you. How many of these How many of these Dogos have been found, and are they all of similar size?
Yes, 4,500 of them have been unearthed in Japan. They are all, 3 to 12 inches in size. There are some smaller ones. Some of them are so abstract you wouldn't be able to pull the information out of it. And much of the archaeological data to date is so abstract. A high level of it is mathematics that are encoded into it. We just don't speak that language at this point.
Are they all dressed?
They're dressed
similarly?
Yes, they're dressed because they're addressing the atomic states, the dress state of an atom. It's a clue. They're pinched, they're squeezed because they have an hourglass shape, because they're discussing the hourglass mode that occurs in the optical waveguide.
On your RAM wing or your RAM implosion wing, are you pursuing to get more of that on cars and have it tested and verified so that, the numbers you quoted are fantastic?
Yes, sir. I've built 50 of these this year, and so there's about 50 people testing it. And out of those 50, 3 or 4 people found no mileage at all. 2 or 3 people found between 6 and 10 mpg, and the other 40 some odd people found double their mileage. I just did a commercial application this last weekend. I put a 75-pound, 6'3" wing on a guy's delivery van, a 3/4 ton Ford van, and he generally delivers auto parts. His mileage is 14.4. He keeps immaculate records because that's how he gets paid. After we put the wing on his vehicle, we did a number of back-to-back tests, 8 of them to be exact, and we realized that we went from 14.4 to 45 miles to the gallon. Now, when he left and drove home, he had a decrease in mileage. The reason being is the wing weighed 75 pounds, and it actually dented the roof on his vehicle and changed the sweet spot angle of it. He got home, he gave me a call and said, look, I got 2 or 3 miles to the gallon out of what happened. And I said, well, did the wing move? And he got up there to verify, and he actually moved the wing himself and had it all in some other different alignment. But he also realized that it had dented the roof on his vehicle. Well, we knew this might happen, and I explained to him that he was in a guinea pig position. He then decided to get some aluminum brackets and jack the wing back up and brace the wing on the back of his vehicle. Once he did that, he didn't have a chance to readjust the wing because he got called back to duty, and he had to carry 2,800-pound delivery on his delivery. But he went from the 14.4 to 20 mpg with 2,800 pounds on board and a detuned wing.
2 questions. The Dogu, what does that mean? And
Well,
the second question, how many wings are have you sold to the public and that are functioning now?
Okay, the wing first, approximately 50 units have gone out. They're all prototypes, just like this one. This is as sweet as it gets. There's reasons for its shape. There's reasons for the texture. If you have a smooth surface, the air can stick to that surface. If you have a textured surface, the air leaps off of it and you get a vacuum layer between the object and the air. And the more vacuum energy that you can command, the more energy that you can transfer. The other question was Dogu, and I was going to tell you that just before I concluded. I've decided that Dogu is dampened wave oscillatory gravitic unit, and it has other meanings. You can actually take the DOGU and go into the appendix of your electronics dictionary, and you can look up the D, the O, the U, and the G, and all of a sudden you find out that you have a mass energy equation and a unification factor in the word Dogu.
One more question up here. Your friend with the delivery van and his increased mileage, about how long were his runs? Was he mostly freeway or in neighborhoods?
Yes, his original run home was 870 some odd miles, and that's when the wing had dented the roof of his vehicle and he only saw 2 or 3 mpg on the way home. The short little runs that we took were little 20 miles, 40 miles, 140 miles, and every one of those little runs we saw 40, 45 miles to the gallon. But by the time that he left, we're way out in the country, there's a lot of ruts, and hitting all the bumps and stuff and the bad roads allowed the wing to settle into the roof line, which changed its pitch angle, and he only saw about 3 mpg on his way home, but he rectified that. I'm not in communications with him. I don't carry a cell phone. But he did rectify it, and before he had a chance to retune the wing, he carried a 2,800-pound payload. I believe it was 56, 58 miles, but he noticed that it went from 14.4 to 20 mpg.
Okay, we got about 45 seconds. I think we got room for one more question. I think it was one over here.
Yes, Robert. I wanted to find out what your thoughts are as this potentiality for flight on its own propulsion system eventually in the future.
Could you repeat that?
Yes, I wanted to get your thoughts about what its potentiality is for future for flying on its own propulsion
most
system.
definitely. The Airbus, we're going into space, folks. We're going into space. We're going to go there. We're going to be tourists. We're going to colonize other worlds. The reason we're going to do that is because we're going to marry implosion and explosion technology together. We're going to figure out how to selectively shape our conductors so that they can become self-cooling, so that they can gear into the wheelworks of nature, so that we can use the energy that's there, which is already rotating. That's the idea behind some of this technology here. Let's take away the mechanical rotating device, but let's keep the function. So now the environment becomes the rotator and the device becomes the stator. We now have no moving part machinery, and it doesn't matter which end of the spectrum you use, air, water, electromagnetic energy. You must remove the mechanical part, but take the function of that part and realize that the environment is that function. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Hey, I didn't get any heckle from you, man. You were supposed to heckle me.